So tomorrow the Feds are going to talk about announcing a rate hike for September 2022, and the market seems to be pricing in anywhere between a 50 to 100 basis point rate hike. Now let's take a look at some of the math behind that. We have a national debt of $30 trillion, and the average maturity of this debt is only a few years off. So all of this debt will have to be refinanced within the next 1 to 2 years, which means that 30 trillion, 1% of that would be $300 billion that we have to add to our deficit for every 1 basis point rate hike. To put that in perspective, right now our deficit is about $1.2 trillion. Take a look at some of the other items in our budget. Interest on the debt is $445 billion as it is, and it's going up because of all the rate hikes that we've already had this year. And every 1 basis point that we increase it is almost going to double that. So it's almost impossible for us to just continue to raise rates unless we can reduce our national debt. How are we going to do it? History shows that we're going to inflate away the national debt before we raise rates. So if history is any indicator, the Feds will have to pivot in order to erase a bunch of the national debt via inflation. And once the national debt is below a certain percentage where we can actually afford to raise rates, then we'll do that. To show you how that looks, we can just go back to the 1970s. In the 70s, inflation between 1960 and 1980 went from about 1% up to a high of 15%, if we can believe some of those numbers. And notice this pivot over here. So what the Feds did was dropped interest rates in the mid-70s. There was a mid-course correction. Where are interest rates? Here's the interest rate history. And you can see 2 pivots in the 1970s where the interest rate was dropped to 6%, while inflation was 12%. So basically we had to erase 6% of the national debt every year for a number of years. Another historical chart we could do is the debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio history. And between the 70s and the 80s, there was a time where it dropped off. Here we go. In 1970, it was 35%. 1980, it was 30%, despite all of the borrowing. So what we did was we inflated a lot of the debt away, and then we started raising interest rates in order to bring inflation under control. We could also look at historical examples in other countries around the world. So in Poland, interest rates were not raised until the 1990s. Inflation, let's see if we can get the historic inflation rate in Poland. Inflation rate, Poland, history. But in 1989, they printed a 20,000 Zoid note. For some reason, my connection is down. There we go. So here's the history of their inflation. It hit a high in 1989 of 500% a year, but they didn't raise interest rates until closer to this area, the mid-1990s. And they actually still use the same currency as they did before 1989. It's just that every 10,000 became one, I think in 1989 or so. So history shows that we're going to inflate away a bunch of our debt and then raise interest rates. So we got a pivot coming up. So if you're phased about all this interest rate hike being bearish for gold, it's too early to worry about that. We still have to inflate away our debt before we could raise interest rates, if history is any indicator.